Job can be seen as another version of the figure of Gilgamesh. Both of them are acutely aware of the brevity of human life and the harsh reality of death. Both raise a protest against their gods that the terms of human existence have been determined in the way they are. They thus both raise an objection to the basic facts of life. They struggle with the injustice that they see in the world. In neither case do they attain a fully satisfying explanation, even though the writers of both stories try to supply a happy end. We never really learn why innocent people must suffer in the case of Job, and Gilgamesh never manages to overcome human mortality. But despite the similarity in the stories, there are important differences. The ancient Hebrews have a different relation to their god than the one found in Gilgamesh. In general, the relations between the humans and the Mesopotamian gods are marked by dissatisfaction and even open animosity. One recalls Enkidu's insult to Ishtar. The Hebrews' relation to Yahweh is different from this. Job does not want to believe that God can be unjust, and his friends categorically reject the idea. By contrast, the Mesopotamians have no compunction about thinking this about their gods. Yahweh has a special relation to the patriarchs and regards the Hebrews as the chosen people, having made a covenant with them. While the individual Mesopotamian gods are helpful to specific individuals, this varies on a case-by-case basis. They're not positively disposed towards everyone. Moreover, Yahweh remains a somewhat distant authority figure who's difficult to understand, whereas the help of the Mesopotamian gods seems more direct and concrete. We all have an intuitive sense of justice and the way things ought to be. And like Gilgamesh and Job, we're disappointed and frustrated when this doesn't match the reality that we see around us. Where does this ought come from? Why do we believe that the world should conform to our conception of what should be the case? An important part of this comes from the idea that there is a just God who rules the world. In such a just world, certain things ought to be the case, and others ought not. Even though the gods in Gilgamesh are not regarded as just in the same way, they still could, in principle, make humans immortal if they wish to do so. Thus, the ancient Mesopotamians and Hebrews have a strong sense of the ought that they cannot reconcile with their gods. Indeed, their gods' inability or unwillingness to change things to accord with how they ought to be is a key element in their dissatisfaction. If the gods were just and powerful, then why don't they make changes for the better? It's interesting to note that the human protest against the terms of existence can be found in other cultures right up to our present day. This is a fundamental motif, for example, in the existentialist movement of the 20th century. This is in some ways striking, since one large wing of the existentialist movement purports to be atheistic. But if there's no God, then there's no reason to claim that something ought to be different, since, as we just saw, this is predicated in the conception of a God or gods who can potentially do something about injustice. Here we can see how certain religious conceptions and intuitions remain even in the most secular views. It will be noted that the ought is an idea that's used as a contrastive term to reality. We usually think that concrete physical things in the world are what's most real from a metaphysical point of view. By contrast, ideas are fleeting. We have lots of ideas that never amount to anything or are never realized. We often say, for example, oh, it was just an idea, to indicate that it was not something important. So our common sense tells us that physical things are greater, more real than ideas. But in the case of Job and Gilgamesh, just the opposite's the case. The ought is greater than reality. Reality is imperfect and ought to conform to their idea. In this sense, the idea of justice in the human mind is greater than the existence of it in the physical world. Thus, although we feel strongly about concrete things such as having nice cars and houses, we can even become more impassioned about abstract ideas such as truth, justice, and freedom. This is just the opposite of the first view. Here, the idea is more important. In the context of Judaism, the dissatisfaction with their fate can be explained in a different way. The covenant that they made with God and continue to renew imposes certain obligations on them. God promises to protect them and to scatter their enemies if they keep their part of the agreement. Thus, when disaster strikes, this provides a ready explanation. They failed to keep the faith or have done something to offend God. The Psalms and the Lamentations are full of text to this effect. God punishes the people for their sinfulness and for breaking the faith with Him in the covenant that they're a party to. It will be noted that this line of thinking is exactly the reasoning used by Job's friends. The people suffer in one way or another, and the assumption is that there must be some reason for this. The obvious reason seems to be that they have offended God somehow, even if they're unsure of exactly how. Thus, there's nothing left to do but be humble, repent, and hope that God can be brought around again. This is likewise the moral to the story of Job. Thus, Job can be seen to mirror much of the broader relation to God that can be found in the history of the Hebrews as traced in the Old Testament.